How's it going, everybody? International Master Danny Rensch here with Week 9 highlights from the United States Chess League a little bit later than usual here today. This is a Wednesday, and you are watching this video before the U.S. Chess League will be live tonight on Chess.com TV, so show up for that in case you haven't watched a live show yet. You're in for a treat. I want to highlight a few games that particularly stood out to me before we move on to all three candidates for Game of the Week last week. We start out here today with a game between Mr. Wheeler of the San Francisco Mechanics versus Mr. Hilby of the Los Angeles Vibe, two young players. And what stood out to me, I'm going to kind of whiz through the opening here, and the reason why I chose it. This is in English by Cameron Wheeler, a very talented young man from the Bay Area. What stood out to me, the reason why I chose it, is while I was watching it, I thought it might end up being a candidate for Game of the Week. It was not, but maybe I was just overly impressed by the maturity and the approach taken by Cameron. I was looking at this game and thinking I was watching something out of the 1950s, some sort of flashback where players wanted a positional middle game. And I know this is a part of his repertoire, but the approach taken in this Maroczy bind after this particular position is reached, which is sort of typical in that White has established a bind in the center, which of course gives White a lasting space advantage. But as minor pieces come off the board, if White doesn't know what he's doing, you're looking at long-term dark square problems and other things. And watching Cameron handle this game was like watching a grandmaster grind down, very reminiscent of Gelashvili's win over Becerra a few weeks ago. So here after knight to g4, the point is there's diagonal pressure. Black is headed into e5, but nothing but some natural developing moves is what White needs to do in order to take care of this. And now we reach sort of the first critical moment of the middle game where White has a choice to aggressively expand and play a more typically sharp middle game, or to try to simplify the position and use the space advantage long term. Cameron chose to play knight to d5, which after a few natural moves, once White is really threatening to get going with a space advantage, as is typical in a Maroczy bind. If you're not totally familiar with this structure, you can check out some different videos we have on, I believe, by Grandmaster Akobian, and in the Pawn Structure 101 series, I talk a little bit about this structure. More to come on that, though. But here, after bishop takes d5, e takes d5, and knight to d7, looking at this game, I thought that Mr. Hilby might actually be happy, right? He's traded off some minor pieces, which, as highlighted, when you have less space, i.e. you're cramped in the center, typically less minor pieces means good news for you. And also you have this knight versus this bishop, which in a Maroczy bind, if this knight can establish itself on a dark square and keep himself there, while also preventing White from expanding, let's say some ideal setup like a knight on c5, a pawn on a5, and maybe if there's potential to open up the center at some point, Black can use this knight versus this sort of classically, using my doctrinal quotation figures, bad bishop, right? Because the bishop is closed behind the pawn chain. But those are all sort of general things about this structure that don't necessarily apply here. And Cameron understood that he was going to be able to grab the initiative based on a couple factors. One, he was going to get control over the e-file, which this is a Marco hop structure. I've referred to that a few times. When this knight comes to d5 in a Maroczy bind, and the trade happens opening the e-file, this is what's known as a Marco hop transition, and White uses this open e-file to apply pressure to the backward pawn. That kind of prevents Black from getting full coordination that Black might want to do on the queen side, for example. So not only did he understand that the e-file would be used, but also that he would be able to quickly expand his space advantage on the queen side. Makes a few moves here with this check, and now b4. And still, even in this position, I believe that the computer would highlight it as only a slight edge for White. But again, despite the classical evaluation that, the c-pawn might be weak here in this Maroczy bind, and this knight is potentially better than this bishop if the structure, all things remain the same, and some things like that, White understands that Black really has no good plan here. This bishop is really a cutting dagger into the heart of Black's position, preventing pressure from the c-pawn, and if Black just sits on the position, White is going to expand slowly. Just a very mature approach by Mr. Wheeler. So here Black, understandably so, kind of lashes out and tries to break up the structure, hoping, did I just make up that word? Hey, right? Made up a new word today. Let's hashtag that on Twitter, hoping. He's hoping here that the b-pawn will be weak and that Black will get his needed counterplay. But a few accurate moves here by Mr. Wheeler, starting in this position if you want to pause the clock and say, hey, what would I play here as white? Prevent black from ever unbinding. First the move rook a6, boomtown, exclam, for reminding black that any trade here turns these doubled isolated pawns into connected passers, right? That's no bueno. But sitting on the position isn't really going to work either, especially after queen to d4, threatening to win a rook, e5, and now the most mature thing of all, just shuffles the queen. Evaluating this position, it's possible that making an exchange here with the queen, going for the two rooks for the queen, or other sort of concrete ideas might be possible, but Cameron just understands from a mature perspective that black has no moves in this position. And after queen to c4, you look at tactics with knight takes d5, but there's not really anything to show for it. After a move like bishop to g2, black has just lost. The threat of a discovered becomes a bad pin for black. And after e4, you can pause the video if you want to find the last decisive mature move by Mr. Wheeler. No, he didn't go for anything like queen to c6, which, as good as this move looks, would actually run into some counterplay issues after a move like queen e7. So he just finds the mature move, queen to d4. So looking at the last few moves, what happened was the queen shuffles back, it goes up, slides over, and just showing that, or reminding black that basically there are no moves for him in this position as long as the queen maintains this dominant position in the center. And now black has to start lashing out, takes on a6. Probably taking with the pawn would be good enough too, but why give up the d5 pawn when I don't have to? White just increases the pressure, and before we know it, is completely winning after a few very obvious enforcing moves. So hats off to Mr. Wheeler for a very well-played game, and a game that I enjoyed watching from a positional perspective, right? Learned a little something about chess I did from the youngster, so good for him. Let's move on. Our next highlight comes to us courtesy of Mr. Eckert of St. Louis and the young Jeffrey Xiong. We're sticking with the young theme here, and what a season the young Xiong is having, leading the MVP points and would be running away with it if not for the recent dominant performance by Mr. Zviad Azoria. We're going to see one of his recent wins next. But here Jeffrey just launches another amazing plan, a logical plan, of course, but a deep plan when I believe that he had already planned on making a sacrifice of the exchange, a long-term sacrifice, when he started this plan with this move, knight to d7. Obviously, trying to fill the c5 square is a very common positional approach in what is a here reverse Benoni pawn structure. By Benoni, you're usually looking at a structure that comes from a Benko Gamma declined or a some sort of Benoni type of King's Indian. So normally you can see these structures with the reverse colors, and white trying to establish a pony on a square like c5, which not only serves very great defensive purposes, defending a pawn on an open file, but also serves very good attacking ideas when it comes to supporting ideas of e4. And so this is sort of a no-brainer maneuver, not getting a ton of points for that. But he is getting points that obviously knight d7, he must have anticipated knight e4 coming. And there's no way he wasn't prepared to make this exchange sacrifice with f5, allowing the discovered check by the queen. And then instead of looking to capture on d6, giving up this critical dark square bishop and looking at a thorn on d6 for the rest of the game. Just an FYI, something like takes. There's ideas with queen to c4 or even queen to d5, and this pawn is not going anywhere for a while. The bishop is coming to a3, and black has some issues. So there's no way he didn't play knight d7 with this exchange sacrifice plan in mind, or at least not f5. And that's why I look at it and gave this game a lot of kudos. He just plays knight takes c5, allowing this Chekaruski, and says, you know what, I understand that square control and piece activity is actually what we're after here, not just the points. So you can take your exchange and keep it too, right? You can have your cake and eat it too. Plays a little tickle with the queen, but he's not really doing that long term. He really wants to expand. And here we see all of black's pieces sort of placed in prime positions to use black's space advantage. Looking at this position, even though we will criticize white's move and Jeffrey goes on to win another seemingly perfect game, the truth is that it's hard to suggest a better move for Eckert than what he did. Being frustrated with his lack of mobility, it's hard to move any pieces for white without running into problems. The best move according to the computer is some move like f3, which voluntarily closes the bishop and might run into a number of moves. E3 can be considered, capturing here and putting a bishop on d5 can be considered, so it would be a hard move to play. But Eckert played queen to d2, sort of getting frustrated with this whole queen on h6 thing out of play. It gives back the exchange and heads toward a very forcing sequence of moves that leaves black up a pawn with dominant piece play. Though again, it just shows you that this young player from Dallas here, Jeffrey Xiong, with a very bright future and maybe an MVP award on his immediate horizon. But just an amazing game by Jeffrey. He went on to win this position up a pawn and with dominant piece play. So we're going to move ahead to another highlights. But hats off again to the leader of the MVP race currently. If you're wondering what I'm talking about, by the way, with the MVP race, whether you're watching this on YouTube or Chess.com, go to uschessleague.com and check out the MVP points. It's on the homepage, and you can see which players are having the best seasons. It's kind of fun and gives you a rooting interest, even if your team is out of it. That's it, everybody. We're getting toward the end of the season. We have Week 9 U.S. Chess League highlights video. That's what you just watched. Thank you for joining the show here. Make sure you join the live show on Tuesday and Wednesday nights over on Chess.com TV. You can follow all the action in the live chess arena. Find out more about your favorite teams by joining the fan clubs on Chess.com. You can also visit the uschessleague.com website. Make sure you follow everybody on Twitter, the US Chess League. Follow me on Twitter, and I will see you around over on Chess.com.